Alexander sat in his office, scrutinizing the financial reports on his desk. The working day was coming to an end, but his thoughts still wouldn't rest. He was the owner of several large companies, and each of them demanded his attention. His life had long ago become a series of endless meetings, calls, and negotiations. The status of a successful businessman was familiar to him, but despite all his achievements, Alexander felt that something was missing, something important, intangible, escaping his attention. He couldn't remember the last time he had experienced truly genuine happiness. His life was like a perfectly built mechanism that worked smoothly but lacked warmth. The foggy Moscow fall was getting colder by the day, and with it came a feeling of stagnation. Lights shone outside the windows of the building in the center of the city, but they seemed so distant and alien. Alexander took a cup of coffee in his hands and thought that if it weren't for his career, if it weren't for these endless business negotiations and meetings, maybe he would have had a chance to really live. He thought about his past, how once, when he was young, he had a family, he had everything he could have wished for. But now, years later, it was all just ashes that he had long ago tried to scatter. Reflecting on his loneliness, Alexander suddenly heard a sharp sound that didn't fit in with his usual life. Someone was knocking loudly on the door. He frowned, but didn't get up from his seat. One of his assistants must have decided to bring important documents. However, the door opened again, and a young man appeared on the threshold, with a troubled expression on his face. "Alexander, sorry to disturb you, but something strange is waiting for you," said the assistant out of breath. "A baby carriage has been found outside your house. It is standing right by the gate, and there are children in it." Alexander raised his eyebrows in surprise. Children? At his house? It was so unexpected that he couldn't at once realize what was going on, but he saw alarm in his assistant's eyes, and it made him rise quickly. "Where are they?" he asked, already heading for the exit. The aide hesitated a moment, then answered, "We've called the police, but we're still waiting. So far, the kids are in a stroller, but we can't figure out where they're from. There are no belongings nearby, just this stroller." Alexander walked quickly out of the office, feeling the cold wind of the fall evening blow through the building as he left. Something about this event was strange and frightening. He didn't know what to expect, but he felt it must be important. When he arrived at the gate of his house, there was indeed a stroller in front of him. In it lay two infants, both with their eyes closed, as if the world around them was distant and inaccessible. Alexander froze for a moment, and his gaze fell on the small hands hidden under the blanket. He stepped closer, examining the stroller. It was an ordinary city yard, with no strangers or familiar faces. Just babies left here, with no name and no history. "What the hell?" he said quietly, leaning over to see if they were okay. One of the children, a boy, moved and opened his eyes. He looked at Alexander curiously, but did not cry. His gaze was somehow old, tired, as if a lifetime's worth of experience was hidden in that small body. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked softly, feeling his heart clenched with a strange uneasiness. For a second, he thought the boy was reading something important in his eyes. But he didn't have time to continue, as another person appeared nearby, a police officer who hurriedly approached him. "We are checking the entire area right now," the policeman said. "But so far there is no clue as to who might have left the children here. We have no camera footage, and no traces that could point to the parents." Alexander stood watching the police officer's work, but his thoughts were far away. Who were these children? Why exactly were they at his house? He couldn't take his eyes off them. There was something familiar in those eyes, something that made him feel strangely connected to this moment, though he couldn't understand why. A few minutes later, they moved the children into the house, and Alexander decided not to wait, but to call his lawyer. He had had more than one difficult situation in his life before, but this was the first time something like this had happened to him. Children in front of his house was something he had never met before. He called Frank, his longtime friend, and asked him to make the necessary checks. Frank didn't ask any questions, but Alexander realized from his voice that he was worried too. "Are you sure it's not a mistake?" Frank asked after he had heard all the details. "I don't know," Alexander answered, "but it can't just be an accident. I need to find out who they are and why they ended up in my possession." When Frank promised that he would start checking at once, Alexander felt the tension released a little, but deep down, he knew that this encounter with the children left at his house would be much more than just an unusual occurrence. He stood at the window, looking at the two little ones he had accepted as his care. He already knew that his life would change, but in what way, he did not yet understand. The next day began with anxious thoughts. Alexander could not get rid of the feeling that the events that were unfolding around him were not accidental. Everything that was happening seemed too strange to be just another incident. He kept returning his thoughts to the moment he had found the children outside his house. With each passing hour, his certainty that these children were connected to his past grew stronger. But what exactly was it that connected them to him? He didn't know. Time stretched slowly, and while the police did their background check, Alexander began to investigate on his own. He decided to act on his own, for no one but he could figure out what was really going on. The police, as usual, could act according to their standard scenario, search for the parents, perhaps track down someone who had left the children behind. But he wanted to understand what was behind the story, and what exactly he needed to do. He sat in his office, but he couldn't focus on the papers. Thoughts of the little ones filled his head. He thought about what might be involved in his life being so intertwined with this moment. "There's a reason they ended up at my house," he repeated to himself. His intuition told him that this story would affect him far more deeply than he had realized. He decided that despite his doubts, he would continue his search, and no one would stop him from finding out the truth. Scrambling to work, Alexander picked up his cell phone and called Frank. He had to find out more about what these kids were hiding, and how it might all turn out. A few minutes later, his friend's voice came through on the other end of the line. "Frank, I want you to find information about who left the children at my house," Alexander said, not trying to hide his concern. "I need to find out everything possible." Frank, as always, was prompt. "Give me a few hours, Alexander, and I'll try to find out who's behind this. But you need to be prepared for the fact that we might run into some difficult circumstances," Frank warned. Alexander nodded but felt no relief. He knew that Frank would do his best to sort things out, but he was sure that he would only find out the whole truth himself. In the meantime, while Frank worked on his inquiry, Alexander decided to do some more personal investigation. He headed to the archives of his neighborhood, where he hoped to find records that might shed some light on his strange feelings. There had been various incidents in the city a couple years ago, some of which had gone unresolved. He thought that perhaps one of these incidents could be related to the disappearance of children. He went to the local archives, where he was met by an elderly woman who was processing records. Alexander explained to her that he needed to find information about missing children associated with the neighborhoods around his home. "I understand you need to find out what happened to these children," the woman said, pulling out several folders. "I can give you information, but you have to realize that we don't always have all the data. A lot of things are hidden." The woman unfolded one of the folders, and Alexander saw the scanty records about a case of 2 children who had gone missing a few years ago. He couldn't believe his eyes. The 2 children found in the very same stroller he'd learned about the day before were connected to the case. Was it theirs? Alexander couldn't hide the excitement in his voice. Yes, these children disappeared in the same neighborhood where a strange case was reported a few years ago. "And you're right," the woman added. "They were found by the man who was later accused of the crime. He claimed that the children were not his, but had just been left on the street." Alexander couldn't believe what he was hearing. He paused for a moment, trying to digest the information he had received. 2 missing children, a connection to his house. It was too strange to be a coincidence. He couldn't ignore those facts. "So, it's true," he thought. "They were connected to something I didn't even know about." Everything he knew about his relatives and family now seemed like some kind of myth. He had always been sure that his family was an infallible fortress where everything was under control, but now a completely different picture was unfolding before him. Who had left those children behind? And why were they at his house? This wasn't just an incident, it was part of a much more complex story. He quickly thanked the woman for her help and headed for the exit without delay. His mind was full of thoughts. He knew he had to solve this mystery and that something was clearly wrong here. Someone was trying to hide the truth, but he couldn't allow himself to believe it. Outside, he was greeted by rain, and the cold wind chilled him to the bone. He pulled up the collar of his coat and headed for his car. There was only one thought running through his mind. He must solve this mystery, no matter how much time and effort it took. But despite all his determination, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to his questions was much closer than he thought. Alexander couldn't sleep, Even in his spacious and cozy home, he could feel the space around his mind narrowing, filling with questions that demanded immediate answers. After Frank had shown him the photographs and documents, Alexander's anxiety had not left him. He had been prepared to face the secrets his father had kept, but now he stood on the edge of a new reality. This reality that he couldn't seem to get into had become inescapable. He went to the window again, where the darkness of the Moscow night seemed especially dense. He stood looking out into the darkness and felt something important already moving in his life. But what would that move be? The image of the children left outside his house did not leave his mind in any way, and their fate, which was linked to him, kept pulling him along. That same evening, Alexander decided to talk to Olga, the children's mother. He could no longer keep everything inside and think it was just a coincidence. The oddities multiplied, and each new discovery only deepened his desire to know the truth. He knew she wouldn't tell everything, but at least partially reveal what was being hidden. He had to. The next morning, Alexander drove to Olga's house. He was determined, but in the back of his mind, he was tormented by doubts. What if she just can't or won't tell? He thought on the way. All these questions were bombarding him every second, but he couldn't stay in the dark any longer. His heart demanded answers. When he approached her house, everything looked the same as before. The same door, the same windows, the same little garden with toys that seemed to have only recently been left behind. But as soon as he stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. Olga met him in the hallway, her face tense. She could see that his expression had changed since they had last communicated. Alexander didn't need to explain that his questions had escalated. "You've come again," Olga said, trying to hide her anxiety. "What else do you want to know?" "I came to understand," Alexander answered, looking into her eyes. "I want you to tell me the truth. Everything that is connected with these children, and first of all, with their origin." Olga sat down on the sofa and sighed. She was silent for a long time, as if she couldn't find the right words. There was tiredness in her eyes, but there was also something else, something like fear. "You're right," she said at last, "but you don't know what's behind it. Are you sure you want to listen?" Alexander sat down across from her and looked carefully into her eyes. "I am sure. I need to know why these children end up in my possession, and what's connected to them. Why do I feel they are connected to my past?" Olga slowly, as if with each word her soul was becoming lighter, began to tell. "These children..." Her voice trembled. "I can't say I know everything, but when I took them, I knew their lives were not easy. One day, when I was working at the orphanage, I happened to find records that dealt with your daughter's disappearance. These children were connected to her disappearance. When I found them in the place where Alice disappeared, it became clear to me that their fate was not random." Alexander felt his throat go dry. Those words cut into his heart. Alice, his lost daughter who had disappeared years ago, was once again part of the story. He had always considered her loss an inexplicable event, an empty hole in his life, but now everything had changed. It's clearer. "You're saying that these children are connected to Alice?" Alexander said, trying to understand what he was saying. "That's impossible. How is it possible?" Olga stood up silently and went to the window, looking at the street where the rain was slowly washing away the mud from the road. "I don't know," she said, "but I've seen those tapes, and I know for a fact that they're connected. Those children were left in the place where your daughter disappeared. I can't explain why, but they're part of the story. At some point, I realized that Alice and Marina might have been connected more than just by chance." Alexander felt a void beginning to form in his soul. It all seemed impossible, but at the same time it was so plausible that he couldn't ignore it. Such a long silence, such dark secrets that had been hiding from him, were now tearing at his consciousness. Someone may have been trying to hide the truth, but now that truth was closer and closer. "Are you sure they're connected to Alice?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Olga, without turning, nodded. "I don't know what was really going on, but when you said you had them, I realized that maybe it was a sign. Maybe you are the person who can find out everything." Alexander felt a chill run down his back. He was on the verge of figuring out what had happened and what he should do with that knowledge. But he knew one thing. This story had only just begun, and he had a long way to go to uncover all of its secrets. "I have to understand what happened," he said, deciding for himself that he would not stop halfway. Olga sighed quietly, but there was something in her gaze that said, she realized that now this path would become unavoidable. Alexander spent the next few days searching like a flood. He searched for traces that might reveal the whole truth. And although Olga had told him of the connection between the children and the disappeared Alice, he still could not fully believe the fact. It seemed incredible. 2 children found outside his house about whom he knew nothing at all. It was too strange to be true. But the inner feeling that had gripped him when he had met them would not let him go. There was something familiar in their eyes, something he couldn't explain. This feeling tormented him. He became more and more immersed in the investigation. Every minute he became more certain that these children were indeed related to his family. He tried to gather more information, to contact those who might know details about Alice's disappearance. His tracks led him to an old man who had once been a friend of his father's and worked at an orphanage where disadvantaged children once ended up. The old man was rumored to know more than he was willing to reveal. Alexander, without hesitation, went to see him. His visit was brief and unencumbered by unnecessary words. The old man met him in an old abandoned apartment that kept the traces of time. The apartment was dark and cold, and the smell of dust and old books was in the air. "Well, what do you want?" the old man asked when he saw Alexander. His eyes were clear but tired, like a man who had already been through a lot. Alexander did not waste time on unnecessary talk. "I'm looking for information about Alice. I know you might know what happened to her. I know you have connections to those children that were found in my possession." The old man looked at him carefully but said nothing. He turned, walked slowly over to his desk, pulled out an old folder and placed it in front of him. "You're right," he finally said quietly. "There are some things you should know, but you're going to have to be prepared for what you hear." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. He was ready for any confession, even the worst. The old man opened the folder and pulled out several yellowed pieces of paper. He began to read, and with each word Alexander felt the ground go from under his feet. "Alice. Alice wasn't just your daughter," the old man said. "I can't tell you the whole truth, but she was part of something bigger. It wasn't just a case of her disappearing. These children you found are your family, but your father. He was hiding a lot of things." Alexander felt his heart beat faster. All this time he'd been living in a world of illusion. His father, the man who had always been the ideal for him, turned out to be someone who held many dark secrets. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "What did this have to do with children?" The old man put the folder down on the table and looked at him tiredly, as if those words he had spoken had come out with great difficulty. "Your parents were not what you thought they were," he said. Both Alice and these children, they are bound through ancient broken bonds. You were part of their game, but you knew nothing. You are not the only one who has experienced this." The old man's words began to jumble together in Alexander's mind. He couldn't understand exactly what he had just heard, but the sense of inevitability they brought wouldn't leave him. He was part of some dark circle he didn't know about. Everything he thought he knew turned out to be a lie. "I can't believe it," he said, feeling his voice shake. "But if it's true, what can I do? How can I help these kids if I don't even understand what's happening to me?" The old man looked at him sympathetically, but there was a shadow of pain in his eyes. "This isn't just a question about helping the kids," he said. "It's a question about you. Your family has been involved in complex games that have been passed down to your generation. You can't just remove yourself from it. You have to figure out who's behind it all and why these kids ended up in your care. You have to find the answer, and only you can do that." Alexander fell silent. He realized that now his life, his family, everything he had once known had been shattered. He was ready to come to the truth, but what if it proved too scary for him? What if he couldn't get over the fact that his own roots had been consumed by this darkness, this evil? "I have to understand everything behind this story," Alexander said, slowly rising from his seat. "If I have to go through with it, I will do so, but I want to know the truth completely." The old man nodded, but his face remained grim. He understood that Alexander had not yet realized how much his life would change once he learned what his past was really hiding. "I understand," the old man said, "but be prepared. You don't know what awaits you." Alexander left the apartment, immersed in his thoughts. He knew one thing. Now everything was not the same as before. He was ready to go all the way. But In the back of his mind, he already felt that this path would lead him to something greater than he could have imagined. He was ready to break down all barriers. The day after his meeting with the old man, when Alexander's thoughts were still reeling, he realized that his life would no longer be the same. Everything he knew, all of his former beliefs, seemed like lies. The mystery he was just beginning to unravel was far deeper than he could have imagined. He didn't know what to make of this new reality, and to be honest, he wasn't sure he needed to seek the truth. But deep down, he knew he couldn't back down. The question that had become central to his life was, who was he really and what was his family hiding? With each step in this tangled story, Alexander felt his world crumbling and something new, frightening and uncertain, taking its place. He came to the realization that he should meet with anyone who could tell him more about these dark matters. But at that moment he had a question that kept him in suspense. What if the truth was unbearable? What if it destroyed everything he had built and redefined his whole life? That evening, sitting in his office, he looked again at the papers the old man had handed him. Those old papers, yellow with time, were still a mystery to him. Something about them frightened him, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to know what was going on in his family and who was involved. The information he already knew gave him a choice. Give up the investigation and go back to his normal life, or go all the way, despite the consequences. But whatever choice he made, this story could no longer be erased from his memory. Alexander decided to have another meeting, this time with Olga. He needed to understand what she knew and what consequences her actions might have on the children's future. He could not leave them in the state they were in. He had to do something. He called her and set up an appointment for tonight. When he arrived at her house, Olga met him with a slight concern in her eyes. Her expression was more wary than before, and that couldn't help but be alarming. "Have you decided to talk?" she asked, inviting him into the house. "What do you need to know?" Alexander sat down on the couch and looked at her, trying to control his emotions. He didn't know what to expect from this conversation. He only knew one thing. He needed answers. "Olga, I can no longer turn a blind eye to what's going on," he began. "I've seen the tapes, I've heard about Alice, I know these children are not random. You have to tell me what happened. Who left them outside my house? Why are they connected to my past?" Olga sighed heavily, as if her soul was ready to reveal all its secrets, but at the same time she was not ready to do it. "You're right," she said, giving in to his insistence. "But you won't understand everything unless you hear the whole story." Alexander was ready to hear everything. He realized that only she could tell him what had long been hidden from him. I found out about it quite by accident. My husband and I had been trying to have children for a long time, but nothing had worked out. And then, when I was working at that orphanage, I came across some files that talked about your daughter. Alice, she disappeared at the same moment that two children, a boy and a girl, were left in the same place where you had been gone for a long time. My husband and I decided to take them because they were in almost the same situation as we were abandoned, left behind. I couldn't understand it, and I had a lot of questions, but I decided that if I took them, it would at least give them a chance. Alexander listened to her, feeling his inner world crumble. Everything that had seemed logical and understandable was now losing all certainty. He was part of a story he didn't know, part of something that remained hidden behind the walls of his life. "Are you saying these children are my grandchildren?" he asked, his voice squeezed. "Were they found in the same place where Alice disappeared?" Olga nodded. Her face was sunken in sadness, but she couldn't hide the truth. It was so important that there was no point in hiding it any longer. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet and filled with pain. "These children are connected to your daughter. I can't explain everything, but I know it's true. Your family is hiding a lot more than you realize. And now these children have become a part of your life. You can't ignore them." Alexander sat in silence, digesting what he had heard. He didn't know what to make of it all. His world was now turned upside down. This wasn't just an accident. He was involved in something much bigger and darker than he could have imagined. He felt the tension begin to bubble up in his chest. He was ready to find answers, no matter how difficult they would be. But now that the truth had been revealed, he knew that his life would always be connected to these children, to Alice, and to what had happened all those years ago. "I can't just forget what I've learned," he said, standing up. "I'm going to keep looking. I have to find out who else is involved. I can't stop." Olga looked at him with respect and concern. She realized that he couldn't just leave things as they were, but she also knew that perhaps the truth he was striving for would be too much for him to bear. "I hope you'll be ready for what you find out," she said quietly. "And remember that you are not alone in this. You have to find the strength to get through all of this." Alexander nodded, decided that he wouldn't stop until he knew the whole truth, and in his heart the determination to go all the way.